I'm Siddhant Ani and you're watching Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch from the People's Dispatch studios here in New Delhi. And we're starting the show today with Sudan, where 1 year after the October 2021 coup in which Abdel Fattah al-Burhan took over control of a government in which he was already in many ways running. Pro-democracy protesters, that is the people of Sudan, continue to reject the military's participation in government and the economy and the interfering role that foreign powers have played in the country, at least since 2018. Tens of thousands took to the streets again in Khartoum and elsewhere across the nation to mark 1 year of the coup and reinforce the unequivocal message to the establishment both in Sudan as well as the larger international community. Right, People's Dispatch's Pawan Kulkarni has been putting together the reports coming in from Sudan and sending them to Prashant, who's in studio now with all the details. Prashant, despite the serious sort of suppression that the protests are facing, people continue to be on the streets, continue to be strong and organized.
Right, Zan. So what we've seen yesterday is, like you said, it was the first year anniversary of the coup, led by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, where basically he deposed pretty much a government he was already in many senses in charge of. So, in the days, in the months that have since passed, I think about 120 people have died, and yesterday too, one person died. But nonetheless, the fact is the protesters have continuously been on the streets over all these months, as we've reported on many occasions. Yesterday too, massive protests taking place, especially in Khartoum state. I believe that state alone saw 185 people getting injured. A lot of attempts being made by the government to block protesters in various ways possible. For instance, the internet was definitely cut off. There have been reports of that. The fact is, other reports have stated, for instance, how that when people were being taken to a hospital, they were attacked by security forces. Generally, security forces using all kinds of very powerful force to confront and target the protesters as much as possible. The one person who died in the protest yesterday died because a military vehicle ran over him. So that also exemplifies the approach with which the military regime has actually targeted these protesters. But this has not stopped these protesters across the country. In fact, we also have a map which shows a number of the protest sites. And this really, I think, speaks to the strength of this movement, which despite 1 year of repression has continued to stay strong, to stay on the streets. There are multiple actions going on right now, have been going on continuously. Some of them more trade union based, more in specific sectors, some of them more at a neighborhood level. In fact, we know that the neighborhood resistance committees have been the backbone of these protests in Sudan, along with sections of the Sudanese left, such as the Sudanese Communist Party. So all these forces have been continuously mobilizing through all these months, despite the fact that international players have not perhaps acted in real good faith, and they have actually tended to side more often with the military junta, have given the military junta a very wide berth, while making all these noises about return to democracy, etc., etc. The international players have been willing to compromise when it comes to actual democracy itself, whereas it is from these streets, it is from these protesters that the true demand for democracy has continued to come, and which is why there's this slogan of no partnerships, no compromise, because the slogan on the streets has been very clear. They want a reversal of this coup. They want a reversal of many of these arrangements which permitted the military to stay in control, and they want a truly civilian-led and civilian-run government, so to speak, in which they have a say. So which is why I think these protests it's important to keep continuing, important to keep following these protests, keep an eye on it, because Sudan is one of those rare instances. We know that what is called the Sudanese Revolution started in December 2018 and has continued all these years on the streets. So it's not one of those movements which, say, after a particular point was achieved, suddenly completely dissipated or anything of that sort. The protesters have continuously put pressure on civilian political parties, on the military, to sort of reach their aim.
Perhaps a key element there is the fact that they are organized from the ground up, and like you were saying, the neighborhood committee is playing such a big role. In that regard, Prashant, you also touched on what the foreign players are doing. There are negotiations that are ongoing between various elements of the political class in Sudan. What's the update on that front?
Right, so it's a bit muddled right now because there are various proposals coming out. One of the key players here is the Forces of Freedom and Change, which are basically centrist establishment parties who have actually, in some senses, who emerged as one of the protagonists of this whole situation. So they were the forces which signed a deal with the military initially, and then were overthrown last year. So now there's been a round of negotiations with some foreign countries such as America, the United States, the UAE, and all are involved as well. And one proposal that has come out is it's a plan by the Sudanese Bar Association, which would which would bring back civilian rule to the country. Now, there are some issues to it which need to be specifically cited. One aspect is the fact that while the authorities will be civilian, the military will still have a considerable amount of say in how the country is run. Also, there's no real, the military also controls a huge part of the economy. Secondly, and very importantly, and I think this is a very key sticking point for the neighborhood resistance committees, there is a proposal to sort of give amnesty to our leaders of the military who have been involved in a number of atrocities against the civilians. And this is a huge problem as far as many of the neighborhood resistance committees are concerned. So the details of this document are not entirely out yet. Now, it remains to be seen if everyone reaches an agreement on this proposal. Whether, what will happen to the protests on the street, because it's likely that there might be multiple opinions regarding, how the path forward should go. But I think what everyone is trying to sort of bring together is the idea that at least the political elite and the foreign players and the military are all trying to sort of come together with a deal, which I think will change the face of the Sudanese government in various ways. And now there's also the question of whether various Islamist parties who are associated with the former dictator Omar al-Bashir, what role will they play in the new establishment? There are some sections who are relatively okay with them coming back to power. Of course, the neighborhood resistance committees and the protesters, the Sudanese left, are very, very against the possibility of them having any kind of say, those who align with Bashir. So I think a lot of these factors are still a bit up in the air, so to speak, as far as future plans are concerned. But negotiations are continuing on this, and there is, like I said, so there is a pretty strong proposal, the details of which are probably being thrashed out, are being thrashed out right now. So that's what's happening on the negotiation front, and I think once when an announcement is made, I think then there will be a choice for many of these, for the protesters as well, for the political parties as well, in terms of how to take things forward. So, but we can be, I think, fairly confident that whatever comes out will not result, at least the first proposal will not result in true justice.
Consensus
because
or justice,
because I think many of the atrocities the military have committed over all these years, I don't think there's an appetite among the political class or the foreign players to actually bring any of these military officials to justice. So I think that will definitely be a key sticking point.
All right. Thanks very much for that update. And of course, People's Dispatch will continue to cover the movement in Sudan as it continues and bring you events as they unfold. Earlier this week, on Monday morning, in fact, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, or at least 30 of its members, sent a letter to the White House in a very quiet attempt to suggest the idea of that pushing for a diplomatic solution to the war in Ukraine might be a conversation worth having, at least within the Democratic Party. However, the room to have that conversation was quickly shut down after reactions from across the political spectrum, however narrow that might be. Caucus Chair Pramila Jayapal had to issue a quick clarification, saying the grouping is united as Democrats in their support of Ukraine's fight for democracy and freedom in the face of Russia's illegal and outrageous invasion. Now, this is a great story because both the letter and the discourse that followed indicate the level of democracy and freedom in US politics ahead of anything else. Anish joined us earlier via video conference to understand exactly why. Hi Anish, good to see you back on Daily Debrief. We're talking about this letter from the Progressive Caucus, and from the reaction to it among various sections of US polity, you would imagine that they'd sort of painted white doves in the margin and were talking about world peace and such kind of ideal concepts. What exactly did the letter contain that so offended, it seems, everyone across the board?
I think the very basic thing about the letter is that it is calling for a negotiated settlement and diplomacy as an end to the Ukrainian war right now. Now, the thing is that this is the most basic minimum that can be expected at any war or any armed conflict that we can talk about. You don't have a war that just ends on its own, at least in this day and age. You have to have a peace settlement, everything happening at that point in time. And for that, you need to have rigorous diplomatic relations with all the parties involved. And US being a third party in many ways to this war really needs to be part of such negotiations. And that is what the letter has asked for. Now, as you pointed out, the kind of narrative that has been painted so far about the progressive caucus is that they are calling for an end to the war in very, rhetorical terms. They've called for end to any kind of aid. Like that is the sort of picture that is being painted. There is even, but if you look at the contents of the letter itself, it does nothing of that sort. It does not even criticize any of the measures, any of the billions, tens of billions of dollars being spent on Ukraine war assistance that the United States is sending. At least if their word is to be taken, which is that the content of the letters were drafted in June, July, around that time, which again the contents of the letter kind of also disprove in many ways. Even if you take the June July date, like there was a $40 billion package that was granted and included every single one of these signatories approving, voting in favor of that package for Ukraine as military assistance and aid. And even that does not have a mention. In fact, if anything, it lauds the Biden administration for doing all the sort of things that they have done so far in the war effort to talk about. And so this one paragraph, which actually talks about the fact that rigorous diplomatic channels need to be taken up for a negotiated settlement, was something that irked a lot of people within the Democratic Party, especially the established Democrats. Many saw that as an affront to them. Some even tried to make it a problem over time, and all sorts of labels started coming out.
Right. So you've set the context, Anish, pretty well. In that regard, it kind of just highlights. Of course, it's a democratic administration, like you pointed out. This is a caucus consisting of democratic elected representatives. So naturally, they are siding with the party to which they belong. But in a way, the entire narrative that has followed this letter again reiterates the very small difference between the Republican Party on one side and the Democrats on the other.
Yeah, I mean, the difference is quite almost none, actually. There is, in fact, a consensus in Washington, D.C. right now that the war needs to keep going unless Russia is defeated. That's the entire idea right now. The whole point, the anti-Russia rhetoric has taken a sort of a life on its own. And the very fact that these lawmakers had to take a U-turn within less than 24 hours after the letter was made public shows the fact that that sort of war rhetoric is now the most predominant idea that is happening right now, especially when it comes to Ukraine. We can also see how the sort of labels that even came out at the time when the letter was released. There were Democrats who were calling them Putin supporters or Putin apologists. There was even one that actually said compared their call for to push for negotiated settlement between both Ukraine and Russia, and not even considering and even considering diplomatic channels for taking back what they call as annexed territories that Russia has taken over in recent few months. All of that is being compared with certain right-wing Republican talks of cutting off some of the aid to the Ukraine war effort. Now, the problem is that the calls for cutting off aid, considering the fact that the cost of living crisis is spiraling, there is a larger economic crisis in the horizon, actually. We do not know when it is going to hit. There's a recession that is on the horizon. And the United States is spending billions and billions of dollars, more than, I think, close to $16 billion have been spent so far, and more is expected to come by the end of this year at a time when US has its own problems and is not able to fund its own welfare programs very efficiently. And so when the Republicans are talking about repurposing some of these funds for domestic programs, rather than a war effort thousands of miles away. And while the Democrats are not pushing for that, and in fact are going for anything that is going after any kind of compromise, or any calls for compromise, rather, shows how war hawkish policy have taken over the entire Democratic Party right now. In fact, we have to remember there is one statement that even came out by a senior Democrat official that says that winning the war is the only way for the war to settle or for peace to come. So, which shows that there are diplomatic relations or any kind of diplomacy, for that matter, is not something that the Biden administration is even considering at this point in time. And they will not tolerate anybody who will even talk about that right now.
Otherwise, all right. So that pretty much sums it up from Anish there. So for those of you watching in whatever part of the world you are, if you're worried about bankruptcy in political discourse, don't worry, you are not alone. The richest country in the world suffers from the same issues. And that also brings a wrap to this episode of Daily Debrief. From Manish, myself, and the entire team here at People's Dispatch, thanks very much for watching. As always, for more details on these stories, head over to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and don't forget to follow us on the social media platform of your choice. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.